There's a specific sentence someone said to me that I still think about years later, more often than I probably should. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody yelled it. Nobody meant it as some kind of turning point when they said it. It was just a plain, quiet observation, the kind of thing said almost in passing by someone whose job is to notice things the person in front of them has stopped noticing about themselves, and it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples that took months to fully reach the edges. I'd genuinely like to know if any part of this sounded like your own life, because I read every comment on these, even the ones that come in months after a video first goes up, and I've had some of the most meaningful exchanges of my week come out of a comment someone left at some odd hour half asleep, saying some version of, "This is exactly where I am right now." If that's you, don't hesitate to say so below. There's no judgment here, and honestly, hearing from you helps me know these stories are actually doing something useful out there in the world, not just accumulating views. And while you're down there, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already, because I'd hate for you to miss whatever comes next. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting in an airport departure terminal with 2 suitcases at your feet, and your boarding pass is already in your hand, and the gate number is right there on the screen above you, and you still can't fully convince yourself that you're not making the worst mistake of your life. Not because the destination is wrong, not because you haven't thought it through 100 times, but because thinking something through 100 times and then actually standing at the edge of it are 2 completely different experiences, and nobody ever warns you about the gap between them. That's not a crisis. That's just what doing something real feels like when you've spent too long doing nothing at all. My name is Wyatt. I'm 71 years old, and a little over a year ago I packed everything I could fit into 2 suitcases, closed the door on the house I'd shared with my family for nearly 2 decades, and flew alone to a city in the southern Philippines called Dumaguete, with no family coming behind me, no one to split the confusion with, no one to look at across a restaurant table when I couldn't quite figure out what I'd just ordered and make the whole thing funny instead of just disorienting. I came alone because the circumstances of my life had arranged themselves in such a way that alone was the only version of this decision available to me. And what happened in the months that followed, the stumbling and the disorientation and the gradual, unexpected, completely unplanned accumulation of people who started filling in space I hadn't even realized I'd been leaving empty, that's what I want to tell you about today. If stories like this one matter to you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there's more of this kind of thing coming, and I think you'll want to be around for it when it does. Let me back up to where this actually started, which is not Dumaguete, and not an airport, but a house in Tucson, Arizona, on a Thursday afternoon in October, sitting at a kitchen table with a stack of mail I hadn't opened in 11 days, because opening mail had somehow become the kind of task that required more forward momentum than I was managing to generate. I'd been retired for 2 years by then. My son Marcus had moved to Portland with his family about 3 years before that. My daughter Becca had been in Boston since finishing graduate school, which was now 6 years ago, and she'd built her life there, fully and properly, the way you want your children to do, the way you tell yourself you want them to do, and mostly you mean it. My wife Ellen and I had separated officially 7 years earlier, divorced 5 years after that. The long, quiet kind of marriage dissolution that doesn't produce dramatic scenes so much as it produces a series of gradually more honest conversations, until one day both people realize they've been describing the same problem for years, from opposite ends, and neither description is wrong. Ellen and I had 30 years between us. Not all of it was unhappy, not even most of it. But the last decade had been the kind of coexistence that wears you both down in ways you can't see happening while they're happening. and by the time we actually put the paperwork behind it, both of us felt something closer to relief than grief, which is its own strange kind of grief when you sit with it long enough. We didn't hate each other. We still don't. We email occasionally, the courteous, brief kind of contact that exists in the space between strangers and people who once chose each other. And I think she's doing well in Albuquerque with her sister, and I hope that's true, and I mean that without reservation. What I want you to understand about that kitchen table in Tucson is that objectively, nothing was wrong. I was healthy. I had a pension from 38 years working as a structural engineer, modest but consistent, enough to live on without anxiety, if I was thoughtful about it. I had a house I owned outright. I had 2 children I loved and who loved me back, even from their respective distances. And I sat at that kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon and looked out the window at the yard I'd been meaning to do something with for 2 years. And I felt, with sudden and total clarity, that I was waiting. Not for anything specific, not for a person or a call or a piece of news. Just waiting, the way a room waits when no one's in it. Existing in standby mode. Getting through the days with a kind of competent efficiency that had absolutely nothing driving it beyond the baseline habit of continuing to exist. I want to be honest about that feeling, because I think a lot of people in the general vicinity of my situation know it and don't name it out loud, because naming it out loud sounds, on the surface, like ingratitude. You're supposed to look at what you have and count it and feel fortunate. I did feel fortunate. I also felt like I was disappearing slowly inside a life that had stopped having any real claim on my attention, and those 2 things were both true simultaneously, and pretending only one of them was there wasn't making the other one go away. I'd been reading about the Philippines in a loose, occasional way for about a year before that Thursday. It had started, honestly, because of a colleague from my working years named Dennis, a structural engineer I'd worked alongside for nearly a decade before he retired 3 years before I did. Dennis had done what I was eventually going to do, move to the Philippines about 18 months after his own retirement, to a city on Negros Oriental's eastern coast called Dumaguete, a university town. A city of maybe 250,000 people built along the edge of the Bohol Sea, with a tree-lined boulevard running along the waterfront, and a pace of life that Dennis described to me in an email, without apparent exaggeration, as the closest thing to actual peace I have found in 70 years of looking without knowing what I was looking for. I'd filed that email away. I'd reread it twice over the following year. I'd gone down a fairly serious internet rabbit hole at various points, reading expat forums, watching videos, looking at visa requirements, building in my head a picture of a place I kept telling myself I was just casually curious about. That's how real decisions usually get made, isn't it? Not all at once. In installments, each one deniable, until the installments have accumulated into something you can no longer pretend is just curiosity. Dennis was still in Dumaguete when I finally wrote to him. Married now, actually, to a woman named Gloria he'd met through a community group about a year into his time there, clearly thriving in a way that his working years, if I'm being honest, had not always suggested was coming. He wrote back within a day, told me to come visit before I decided anything, told me the city was different from anywhere I'd been, and that different was the point, told me he had a spare room and that I was welcome to it for as long as I needed to make up my mind. I bought a round-trip ticket for 3 weeks. Told Marcus and Becca I was taking a trip to see an old colleague. They were both supportive in the cheerful, slightly distracted way adult children are supportive of their retired parents' travel plans, when those plans don't require anything of them, which I don't say as criticism, just as description. I arrived in Dumaguete on a Tuesday, flew into Sibulan Airport from Manila, and the airport itself was smaller than I'd anticipated, the kind of airport where you're outside before you've fully registered that you've landed, and the heat met me at the door like a living thing. Not the dry furnace heat of Tucson that I'd spent decades getting used to. Something wetter, heavier, more total, the kind of heat that wraps itself around you and doesn't leave any gaps. Dennis was outside, waiting with a car, older than I remembered, browner from 2 years of equatorial sun, and wearing a short-sleeved shirt with what I can only describe as tremendous confidence in its pattern. Something involving birds of paradise, I think, and looking genuinely content in a way I could see from 20 feet away before we'd exchanged a word. The first thing he said to me was, "You're going to spend the first 3 days hating the heat and the last day of your visit regretting that you have to leave." He was right on both counts. Those 3 weeks were an education, not a smooth or particularly flattering one. I was lost most of the time, in the literal sense, but also in the sense of being a man operating in a context where almost none of his existing competencies were immediately applicable. I couldn't read most of the signs in a useful way. I couldn't always make myself understood in the transactions I needed to complete. The tricycles that served as the primary local transport confused me for the first week. The mechanics of flagging them down, the etiquette of how you indicated your destination, the fact that the price was often negotiated rather than posted, and that my negotiating position was transparently that of someone who didn't know what anything cost. I overpaid for things I shouldn't have, and underpaid for things I didn't realize carried a different expectation, and the whole experience of navigating ordinary life at roughly the skill level of a competent 8-year-old was both humbling and, in a way I hadn't anticipated, interesting. Dennis took me to the Rizal Boulevard on that first evening, the long promenade along the waterfront, where the city essentially gathers at the end of each day, families and couples and groups of students and old men in folding chairs, the whole social spectrum laid out in the open air, along the seawall, with the lights of Cebu visible across the water on clear evenings and a breeze coming off the strait that made the heat of the day feel, in retrospect, like something you'd imagined. I sat on that seawall with Dennis and a bottle of cold water and watched the city organize itself around the business of an ordinary evening, and I felt something I hadn't felt in some time, which was simply present. Not thinking about Tucson, not cataloging what still needed to be done at home, not mentally tracking which day of the week it was and whether it warranted anything in particular. Just there, on that wall, in that air, watching those lights. I stayed the 3 weeks. I left without having made any formal decision. I went back to Tucson and sat at the kitchen table and opened the mail that had accumulated in my absence, and called Marcus and Becca and told them the trip had been good, and didn't say much else, because I hadn't yet figured out how to say the much else in a way that wouldn't concern them more than the situation warranted. I spent 6 weeks back in Tucson, doing what I now recognize as the methodical, slightly compulsive research behavior of a person who has already made a decision and is simply building the infrastructure to justify announcing it. I looked into the Special Resident Retirees Visa through the Philippine Retirement Authority. I spoke with my financial advisor about what a monthly budget would look like, whether the pension was sufficient, what buffers were sensible. I found an international health insurance plan specifically designed for long-term retirees abroad, one that covered hospitalization, major procedures, and medical evacuation, because I knew with certainty that healthcare was the question Marcus and Becca were going to ask first, and I wanted a real answer, not reassurance. I called Dennis once a week during that 6 weeks, asking specific questions, the kind of questions you only ask when you're past curiosity and into logistics. What's the best area of the city for a single person, not a couple, to rent? What's a fair monthly rate for a well-situated apartment? Which local clinics are equipped for serious cases and which ones are primarily for minor things? Dennis answered all of it patiently, and I heard in his patience the recognition of a man watching someone else take the same run-up he'd taken himself a couple of years earlier. The conversation with Marcus was harder than the conversation with Becca, though both were harder than talking to Dennis had been. Marcus's first question was about safety. His second was about healthcare. His third was about what I would do if something happened and no one was there. I answered all 3 questions with the specifics I'd spent 6 weeks preparing, and he listened to all of them, and then he was quiet for a moment and said, "Dad, I want to support you in this. I just need to know that you've actually thought about being alone over there, because being alone somewhere you know is different from being alone somewhere you don't." I told him I understood the distinction completely, that I'd sat with it, that I'd thought about it more than he probably imagined, and that the honest truth was that being alone in Tucson, in a house where nothing required my attention, was a kind of alone I'd already been living in for a while, and that I'd rather try a different version of it in a place that at least had the chance of surprising me. The reaction I got when I first shared what I was planning was more measured than I expected, mostly because by the time I actually said it out loud, I'd already done enough of the groundwork to answer the hard questions, instead of just presenting a feeling and asking for blind trust. There was worry, understandably, the kind of worry that comes from someone who loves you and is trying to picture every way this could go wrong before it happens. I didn't dismiss any of it. I answered what I could answer honestly, admitted what I genuinely didn't know yet, and didn't pretend the whole plan was without real risk, because pretending that would have been its own kind of dishonesty, and I think dishonesty tends to earn less trust than honest uncertainty does, even when the uncertainty is uncomfortable to sit with. Eventually, after a long, quiet pause on the other end of the conversation, I got something short but real, an acknowledgement that fell somewhere between reluctant and genuinely supportive. And I understood, even in that moment, that it was enough, that I wasn't going to get full enthusiasm right away and didn't need it to move forward with something I already knew, deep down, I needed to do. What mattered more than that first conversation, in the end, was what came later, once there was actual evidence to look at instead of just a plan and a promise. Skepticism, I've learned, rarely gets talked out of itself. It gets shown over time through actual results, until eventually it quietly gives way on its own, without anyone needing to win an argument about it. He was quiet again, and then he said, "Okay, I hear you." I told him that was enough for me. Becca cried a little, briefly, then collected herself and asked, in her characteristic way, whether I'd looked into how voting from abroad worked, because she was not going to have her father become politically unaccountable at this stage of life. We both laughed at that, and the laugh broke most of the tension, and by the end of the call she'd asked Dennis's phone number to add to her own contacts in case she ever needed someone on the ground quickly, which I thought was very Becca. I sold the Tucson house. That process was its own kind of reckoning, the way I think any long departure is, regardless of where you're departing from. The house had been mine alone for the years since the divorce, so there was no shared history to navigate in the sorting, but there was plenty of personal history, 38 years of accumulated objects that had to be evaluated one at a time against the question of what actually needed to come with me, what could go to Marcus and Becca, what could go to Goodwill, and what was simply the residue of a life that had already changed shape without my fully noticing. I found, in a box in a hall closet, A set of architectural drawings I'd made for a house that Ellen and I had once talked about, building on a piece of land we never ended up buying. Ambitious drawings, full drafts, clearly made with real enthusiasm for a future that didn't unfold the way either of us had expected. I kept them. They're rolled in a cardboard tube in my apartment in Dumaguete, and I look at them sometimes the way you look at evidence that you once wanted things with real energy, as a reminder that the capacity for that kind of wanting didn't go anywhere, just because the specific thing you'd wanted changed. I flew out on a Friday in late spring. One-way ticket this time. 2 suitcases, same as I'd brought for the trial visit, but now permanent, now the actual beginning rather than the careful preliminary. Dennis met me at Sibulan again, same shirt, I think literally the same Birds of Paradise shirt, and he drove me directly to the apartment he'd helped me secure from a distance over the prior weeks. A furnished unit on the 3rd floor of a modest building, about a 10-minute walk from the boulevard. 2 bedrooms that I'd never have specific use for, but which cost, at 16,000 pesos a month, something around $285. And the smaller bedroom ended up becoming a kind of workroom. A desk, and a lamp, and the tube of drawings, and a few books, and the stack of engineering journals I'd kept subscribing to out of an attachment to my professional identity that I wasn't quite ready to formally end. The first weeks were harder than the visit had been. That's the thing nobody tells you, and that I should have predicted anyway, having enough professional experience to understand that what a place feels like when you're visiting it, when every new thing is a discovery and the strangeness has novelty, is essentially nothing like what a place feels like when you're living in it, and the strangeness is just the texture of your actual daily life. I struggled with the heat in a way that my 3-week visit had not prepared me for, because during the visit I'd had Dennis's company and a tourist's schedule that built in natural rest, and living alone in a city where the temperature rarely drops below what I'd have considered a hot summer day in Arizona required a physical adjustment I had apparently underestimated. I struggled with the solitude in ways that were specific and, in retrospect, predictable. Dennis had his wife, had his community, had 2 years of established rhythms in the city that I was now on the outside of. He included me generously, made introductions, made sure I had invitations to things. But there's a version of aloneness that exists even in the presence of social kindness. The version that comes from not yet having your own foothold, from still feeling like a guest at someone else's party, rather than someone with your own particular reason to be in the room. I felt that version of alone for the first 2 months, with a persistence that I hadn't fully prepared myself for. I walked. That was the first useful thing I figured out to do with myself. I walked the boulevard every morning, usually before 7, when the heat was still manageable, along the seawall with the straight flat and silvery in the early light, and I walked the streets of the city in less systematic ways in the afternoons, learning the shape of the place through my feet, the way I've always found it easiest to learn a space. There's a market called the Redemptorist Road area that I found on one of those walks about 3 weeks in, a dense, crowded, entirely navigable local market where the produce and the noise and the activity were exactly the antidote to the quiet of the apartment that I needed on the days when the quiet was pressing too hard. I went back to that market often, not always to buy anything, sometimes just to be inside something happening. The adjustment to the food took its own time. I want to be specific about this because I've read accounts that describe Filipino food as an immediate and uncomplicated joy, and for me, it was more like a negotiation. I don't mean that as criticism. The food is genuinely good, and I eat it now with real enthusiasm, but my introduction to it was uneven. Some things were immediately approachable and wonderful. Sinigang, a tamarind sword soup with vegetables and sometimes pork or shrimp, was something I took to almost immediately, especially on the cooler evenings when the air off the sea had a bite to it. Grilled fish, bought directly from the market and eaten with rice, was simple and satisfying in a way that required no translation at all. But some of the other dishes took repetition, took getting past an initial unfamiliarity with flavors I didn't have a prior reference point for, and there were meals in those first weeks where I ate alone in the apartment with something I'd bought without being entirely sure what it was, and tried to evaluate it honestly without the help of another person to triangulate with. The person who started changing the texture of those first months, most fundamentally, was not Dennis, and not anyone I found through any formal expat network or structured introduction. Her name was Rosario, and I met her because of a power outage. About 6 weeks in, the power in my building went out on a Wednesday afternoon and didn't come back for 8 hours. I went downstairs to the small lobby area to ask if there was any information about when it might be resolved, and the only other person in the lobby was a woman who I would later learn was in her mid-60s, a retired school teacher who lived on the floor below me and who was there for exactly the same reason I was, wanting to know when the power would be back because she had fish in the refrigerator she was concerned about. We both received essentially no information from the building caretaker, and we stood in the lobby, looking at each other with the shared understanding of two people who had just been equally unhelpful answers delivered to. And she said, in very good English, "There is a cafe around the corner that has a generator. I am going there. You can come if you like." I went. We sat in that cafe for 2 hours while the power was out. I learned that her name was Rosario, that she had taught high school English for 31 years and had retired 2 years earlier, that she had 3 adult children all living in different parts of the country, that she had lived in this building for 4 years and knew essentially everything about the neighborhood in the particular detailed way of someone who has paid attention to a place for years. She asked me, with the directness I have come to understand, is simply how many people in this city communicate rather than a sign of rudeness, what had brought me here alone, and I gave her the honest summary version. Tucson, retirement, Dennis, the feeling of having been in standby mode. She listened to all of it and then said, "You came to start again." That is sensible. Most people wait too long. Then she ordered us both another coffee and asked whether I had tried durian yet, and, upon learning that I had not, formed an expression that suggested this was a gap in my education that required immediate attention, though she did not move to correct it that afternoon. Rosario became the first genuinely consistent presence in my Dumaguete life that I hadn't come equipped with from Tucson. She had a network in the neighborhood built from years of proximity and natural sociability, and she shared it without ceremony or apparent calculation, simply including me in things the way she would have included any neighbor she'd decided to take an interest in. She brought me to a Saturday morning gathering at a small community garden a few streets over, the kind of informal neighborhood institution that had apparently been going on for years without ever being formally organized. People bringing plants and cuttings and seeds and leaving with other people's plants and cuttings and seeds. A vegetable exchange that served, transparently, as a social gathering with horticultural cover. I knew nothing about the plants and less about the gardening practices specific to this climate, but nobody particularly cared about that, and I spent 3 hours in the early morning sun learning which plants Rosario could name by sight, and watching a neighborhood maintain itself through the small, repeated gesture of showing up. Through that gathering, I met a man named Edgar, who was 68, a retired physician who had practiced general medicine in Dumaguete for 30 years, and who knew, I discovered over the first 2 conversations we had, essentially everyone in a 2-kilometer radius, in the way only a neighborhood doctor ever really does, having seen most of them at their most vulnerable over the course of decades. Edgar was funny in a dry, precise way that took me a few interactions to calibrate to, the kind of funny that hides inside completely serious-sounding sentences until you've been paying close enough attention to catch where the joke was, and I found myself working harder to follow his conversation than I'd worked in any social interaction in years, which, I realized after the 3rd or 4th time it happened, was exactly the kind of effort that makes you feel, afterward, like you've actually been somewhere. Edgar was the one who told me, about 2 months into our acquaintance, that the university, Silliman University, which is one of the oldest and most respected universities in the Philippines, and which sits directly inside the city, with its tree-canopied campus, essentially woven into the urban fabric, had a continuing education program that welcomed community participants in certain non-credit courses. He'd taken a literature course there himself the previous year, mostly out of curiosity, and partly, he said, to see whether 30 years of medicine had destroyed his ability to think about anything that wasn't a presenting symptom. He suggested I look into whether there was anything in the engineering or architecture track that might welcome a working professional turned retiree who was looking for something to put his professional knowledge against. I went to the campus on a Tuesday morning, partly because Edgar had suggested it, and partly because I had walked past its gates enough times to be genuinely curious about the inside, and I ended up in a conversation with the coordinator of a technical vocational program that was building a curriculum around basic structural principles for construction workers, the kind of foundational knowledge that, in the Philippines construction industry, often goes either formally untaught or taught inconsistently. The coordinator was a compact, energetic woman named Professor Bautista, who asked me, within about 5 minutes of sitting down, whether I would be willing to contribute 2 sessions to a module on load-bearing fundamentals, not teaching in a formal sense, more like presenting case examples from 38 years of professional work in a way that might ground the abstract principles in something recognizable as actual practice. I said yes, before I'd fully thought it through, and then went home and thought it through, and still arrived at yes, and those 2 sessions became 4, and the 4 became a loose arrangement where I contributed to the program periodically over the following months. Not as staff, and not as a formal instructor, but as something I didn't have a clean title for, a person with specific knowledge making it available to people who could use it, which is maybe the most honest description of what I'd spent most of my working life doing anyway. Professor Bautista was rigorous and organized, and ran her program with a practical efficiency that I found genuinely impressive. And she had a habit of sending me materials and questions between sessions via WhatsApp that made me feel, for the first time in the 2+ years since I'd retired, like my professional knowledge was still a living thing rather than a historical record. I want to tell you about a man named June, because June is one of the people this past year has produced that I did not anticipate, and who has mattered more than I would have predicted if you'd told me about him in advance. June was one of the participants in that construction vocational program, 29 years old, father of 2 young children, a site foreman who'd been in the industry for 9 years, entirely through practical experience, without formal structural training, and who sat in the front row of every session I contributed to and asked questions that were sometimes so specific and technically sharp that I found myself going home and pulling out references I hadn't looked at in years to make sure I was giving him a complete answer rather than an approximate one. After the last session, June came up afterward and asked, very formally, whether I was available to answer a question about a specific load calculation issue he was dealing with on a current job site. I said yes, and we stood in that classroom for 45 minutes with him describing the scenario and me asking the diagnostic questions I'd have asked in my working years. And at the end of it, I had explained what I believed the solution was, and he had understood it. I could see him understand it. The particular way concentration shifts when a problem clicks into place, and he shook my hand with both of his and said, "I will apply this." Thank you, Sir Wyatt. Sir Wyatt. I'm telling you, that's a thing that takes some adjustment when you're a retired engineer from Tucson who nobody has called Sir since the last time he wore a tie to a client presentation. But I got used to it, the way you get used to all the small, consistent courtesies of this place, which initially feel formal and gradually feel like the baseline of how human beings can choose to treat each other when they decide that basic respect is the default rather than the exception. June and I now meet about twice a month. He brings me problems from current job sites and I think through them with him, and in exchange he has taught me, entirely unprompted, things about this city that I could not have found in any guide or forum. The specific markets that open only on certain mornings, the names of the neighborhoods that the official city maps don't really capture, the best place to get the particular combination of things I was always trying to find after market errands without knowing quite where to look. He brought his family to meet me once, his wife, a quiet, capable woman named Mary Taze, who runs a small sari-sari store, and their 2 children, ages 4 and 7, who regarded me with the frank, assessing curiosity of small children deciding whether a new adult was interesting, and apparently decided I was acceptable. Because the 4-year-old climbed into my lap without asking at some point during that visit and fell asleep there, and that is honestly one of the more unexpectedly moving things that has happened to me in the last year. The health issue came about 8 months in. Not the hospital-level crisis I'd theoretically prepared for with the insurance plan and the emergency contacts, but a sustained week of genuine unwellness, a respiratory infection that in Tucson I would have either pushed through on my own or eventually made a grudging appointment about, but that here, alone, with fewer resources to be stubborn with, required me to actually seek care promptly. Edgar, who by 8 months was genuinely a friend rather than just a neighbor, accompanied me to the clinic he recommended, translated the parts of the interaction where my comprehension fell short, and then came back with me in the evening to make sure I'd understood the medication instructions correctly. The care was prompt and competent, and the total bill was a number that I stared at for a moment, trying to calculate whether I'd misunderstood the decimal point. I had not misunderstood it. It was simply what it was. Edgar told me, watching me stare at the bill, that most Americans have this expression the first time, the expression of a person recalculating a fundamental assumption. He was not wrong. Rosario appeared at my door that same evening with food, having apparently been informed by Edgar, who had apparently told the building caretaker, who had apparently passed it along in some chain of communication I was not fully privy to. She stood at the door with a pot of something hot and said, without preamble, "You should not be sick and eating badly. This is champorado. It is good when you are unwell. Eat it while it is warm." She left it and went back downstairs without waiting for me to say more than thank you, which is, I have come to understand, exactly the kind of care that operates without making its own needs visible, and it is a form of generosity that I did not have adequate prior experience with. When Marcus called that week, and I told him about the illness, I gave him the complete account, the clinic visit, the bill, Edgar accompanying me, Rosario's food at the door, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "So you have people looking out for you over there?" Not quite a question. more the sound of a concern meeting a fact it couldn't dispute. I told him that I did, and that the people looking out for me were not people I'd arrived with or imported from home, but people I'd found in the actual, daily friction of being somewhere new and needing things, and being honest about that need, rather than performing a competence I didn't yet have. He was quiet again, and then he said, "Okay, Dad, I think I'm starting to understand what you were talking about." There is a gathering that happens on Friday evenings in a restaurant on the boulevard, a loose, recurring, not formally organized collection of expat retirees and their local friends and spouses, the kind of thing that has no formal name or membership list, and that you find out about, typically, by being in this city long enough that someone eventually mentions it and invites you along. Dennis had taken me once during the initial visit, but at that point I'd been in tourist mode and the gathering had felt external to me, interesting to observe, but not something I was really part of. When I started going regularly after about 4 months as a resident, it felt entirely different, the way all things feel different when they're part of your actual life, rather than your itinerary. The core of that Friday group is maybe 10 or 12 people on any given evening, though it expands and contracts based on who's in town, who's traveling, whose family is visiting. There's a couple from Australia, Glenn and Terry, who've been in Dumaguete for 6 years and who are, collectively, the most encyclopedically knowledgeable people I've ever met about the city, its history, its quirks, its reliable delights. There's a man from Germany named Dieter who moved here at 72 after a career in manufacturing and who has developed, in his retirement, an improbable passion for local birdwatching and talks about it with the intensity of someone who has discovered, late, the thing they were always supposed to be paying attention to. There's an American named Carl, a former hospital administrator from Ohio, who came to Dumaguete 5 years ago and who has the combination of practical knowledge and genuine warmth that makes him the person everyone at the table directs logistical questions at, and who answers all of them with the patience of someone who remembers asking the same questions himself once. These people are not family. I want to be clear about that, because I think one of the errors in how expat life is sometimes described is the suggestion that you find a surrogate family that perfectly substitutes for the one you have elsewhere. That is not what happened, and that is not what this is. Marcus and Becca are in Portland and Boston, and they are my children, and the relationship I have with them is the relationship I have with them, complicated and loving and entirely irreplaceable. What I found in that Friday gathering, and in Edgar and Rosario and June and Professor Bautista, is something different. A circle, I think is the right word. A circle that assembles itself not from existing obligation, but from genuine choosing, people who are in each other's company because they have decided to be. And there is something in that quality of chosen company that does a specific thing for a person who arrived somewhere alone and was not entirely sure, in those early months, whether he was going to be able to build anything real from scratch. I still struggle. I want to be honest about that too, because I've been talking to you about accumulations and circles and a year's worth of connections, and I don't want that to land as a resolution, as a before and after with clean edges. The adjustment is ongoing. There are days, usually after a long stretch of relative solitude, when the physical distance from Marcus and Becca presses on me in a way that's specific and heavy. Not a general loneliness exactly, but the particular weight of a specific distance. The knowledge that a spontaneous visit is not logistically possible. That a phone call covers the factual contents of each other's lives, but leaves the rest of it, the texture of how they actually are, the way Marcus stands when he's tired, the particular laugh Becca has when something surprises her, untransmittable across 8,000 miles. I accept this. I chose it. But accepting something and finding it easy are not the same thing. There are days when the language gap, which I had told myself would reduce over time, and has reduced over time in practical terms, still produces a kind of isolation that is hard to explain to someone who's never been functionally limited in how they can move through a social environment. My Cebuano, which is the dominant local language in this part of the Philippines rather than Tagalog, is at a level that I would describe charitably as earnest and specifically as embarrassing. And there are conversations happening around me every day in rooms I'm present in that I follow only partially, and the partial following is its own kind of loneliness even when you're in company. There are days when I miss the particular competence of being in a place where I understood how everything worked. Not the place itself, but the competence. The feeling of knowing exactly how to navigate everything, from bureaucratic processes to the geography of the roads. The feeling of being, without effort, fully capable. Here I am still, in many contexts, a person operating at the level of capability my first adult decade in an unfamiliar world would have looked like. And most of the time, that's interesting. And sometimes, it's genuinely exhausting. I tell you all of this not to complicate the more positive account I've also been giving you, but because I think both of them are true at the same time, and the version that edits out the struggle doesn't reflect what this actually is. This is not a fixed thing. It's not an arrival at somewhere better. It's more like a decision that keeps needing to be made again, quietly, on the ordinary mornings when nothing is especially difficult, but the accumulated unfamiliarity of everything presses gently on you and asks, more or less, whether you still mean it. And so far, I still mean it. Every time I check. Something happened about 9 months in that I want to tell you about, specifically because it matters to me, and because I think it illustrates something about this particular city that I hadn't been prepared for. I had been working in the community garden that Rosario had first brought me to, one of the Saturday morning sessions, doing basically manual labor with plants whose names I was still learning, when a woman named Perla, who I'd seen at these gatherings for months, but with whom I'd never had more than a brief exchange, sat down next to me and asked, without much preamble, whether I was doing all right. Not as a greeting, as an actual question. She had apparently noticed, she said, that I'd been quieter than usual for the past few Saturdays, and she wanted to know whether I was well. I sat with that for a moment, because the question was specific, and the attention it implied was something I hadn't expected from someone I knew only in this peripheral way. I told her honestly that I'd had a few harder weeks, that I'd been thinking about Becca and Marcus, that the distance sometimes landed differently on different weeks. She nodded and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "When my children moved to Cebu and Manila, I cried every Sunday for a year. Now I call them on Sundays, and I am happy. But I understand the year before the calling is enough." She went back to her gardening and didn't make a production of the conversation, and I sat there for a while thinking about what she'd said, and it helped, in the specific way that things help when the person saying them has actually lived a version of what you're navigating, rather than just offering a general observation from outside it. Perla is in my Friday group now. She came along for the first time about 2 months after that garden conversation, brought by Rosario, and she's since become one of the regulars, sitting next to Edgar most evenings and maintaining a running commentary on whatever's being discussed that operates somewhere between dry observation and actual philosophical inquiry, and is consistently the most interesting voice at the table. I have a routine now. I want to tell you about it, not because routines are intrinsically compelling, but because for a person who had lost the organizing structure of professional life and hadn't yet found a replacement, the building of an actual routine was a form of recovery I hadn't known I was undertaking while I was doing it. I walk the boulevard in the early morning. I have coffee at a small place near the Silliman Gate, whose owner knows my order and has the particular gift of friendly silence, the ability to be companionable without requiring conversation, which I value more than I once would have thought to. I work at my desk for several hours in the mornings, sometimes on materials for Professor Bautista's program, sometimes on the continuing education reading I've been doing in structural engineering applications for tropical climates, which is a specific body of knowledge I did not have from my Arizona years and which turns out to be genuinely interesting. The engineering problems produced by a very different climate and geography from the one I spent my career in. On Wednesdays and some Saturdays, I'm at the university or at the community garden or both. On Friday evenings, I'm at the Boulevard restaurant with the group. On alternating Sundays, I video call Marcus, and on the other Sundays, I call Becca, and those calls have settled into a rhythm that feels, now, sustainable rather than like a reminder of absence. They've both visited. Marcus came first, stayed a week, arrived with the same careful skepticism he'd brought to the phone conversation about it, and left with what I think was genuine conviction. Not that this was the choice he'd have made for himself, but that it was a real choice made by a real person who understood what he was doing, which is, I think, all a grown child can honestly want from a parent's decision. Becca stayed longer, 10 days, and spent most of it making friends with Rosario, in a way that left me slightly outpaced conversationally, the two of them covering ground in a single afternoon that Rosario and I had taken months to arrive at. Before she left, Becca asked, "Thank you for sticking with me through all of that. I know it's a lot to take in, and I know these stories ask more of your time than most of what's out there, but I hope it was worth it, and I hope some part of it stays with you longer than the length of this video does. If you want more stories like this one, told the same honest way, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because there's plenty more where this came from, and I think if this one landed, you'll want to hear where the rest of them go too. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.